All right, welcome back. And today we want to take a deep dive. I got myself here, Brian Levy in Silicon Valley, and Brother Long here in Rwanda, right? And we're going to take a deep dive on the retrospective, right? So, what's your view on the retrospective right now? What do you think, Brother Long?
That okay, so we've developed the increment
Mm-hmm.
and it's met the definition of done. And now that we put it out, we need to keep the process going. So we're going to do the event called the retrospective and see what went well, what didn't go well, what should we do different next time. And we're going to make sure that we come up with a Kaizen to put at the top of the next sprint backlog. And
Yeah,
so this could also let us morph into the sprint backlog as well.
absolutely. So I'll give you my deep dive take on that, on it.
Okay.
So that again, just a level set, the purpose of the retrospective is to improve our process, to make things more effective. And what typically happens if you're in a situation where you are not reaching your goal, right? You're not doing the things that you think you should meet, you're not producing the results. Well, that means that you took the wrong actions. Well, why did you take those actions? You took the actions that you took because you made some decisions, and the decisions may not have been the best ones. Well, what affects your decisions? You made these decisions because you had some belief systems, some assumptions that were not the best assumptions, right? They were not correct. And because you believed in some things that were not correct, that caused you to make some decisions that were not correct, which actually caused you to make some actions that were not correct, which means that you actually didn't get the results you wanted. So it's this chain that happens, but it starts with our belief systems. So what I want to do in the retro is really start from the end, look at the results we got, and kind of work backwards to figure out what belief systems did we have that actually drove those results. And again, I'll go all the way down the chain that I just mentioned. I'll look at, you know, here's the results, here's the actions we took. I'll go backwards and say, here's the decisions we made. And then I'll go backwards again and say, all right, here's our belief systems. And lots of times, I'll start off with what we call the productivity hypothesis. And the productivity hypothesis, again, each sprint you're having a retro and you're trying to get better at whatever you're trying to do, better at your process. And so each sprint, normally what we do is we have a hypothesis on, you know, using that given if then format. So given our assumptions, if we take these actions, then we should get these results. And so what I'll do is I'll start out the retro by looking at what the hypothesis was in the beginning. And then let's look at the results. We thought we'd get these results. Again, everything in Scrum is gap analysis. So if we thought we'd get these results, let's look at the actual results that we attained. And I compare the two, right? If we exceeded the results, then I would tend to believe that my hypothesis was correct. And if my hypothesis was correct, then I learned something. I can actually form a good conclusion to say, you know what? Yeah, I thought that if I believed in these assumptions, that if I did these actions, I get these results, and it turns out we got the results. So my assumptions are probably true, right? I was right, and these are the right actions to take to get the results. So I learned something. Let me document this. So I make a list somewhere because this is a good learning I have, right? And we can use that information to go forward and make decisions in the future. But often we run into a situation in which you have this hypothesis, right? going back to, I think before we were talking about peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, making those in our example, and I'm like, hey, before I thought that if I actually use the Jiffy Crunchy peanut butter and jelly sandwich, that people would like that better, and because it had the chunks of nuts inside the peanut butter, I would it would be easier for me to spread, and I would actually get the good quality peanut butter and jelly sandwiches out in the back end. But when I did it, it turned out that the big chunks of nuts inside the peanut butter, it actually hurt, and it prevented me from being able to spread it evenly, right? And so now I learned, hey, my initial hypothesis was incorrect. We didn't get the results we wanted. My belief system that the chunks would actually make it easier to spread was absolutely wrong. And now I can reset, and I can actually say, oh, well, now I know the conclusion I should come to is I'm only using smooth peanut butter, right? Only creamy, not using the ones with chunks in it. So again, I use that hypothesis, and I want to investigate and really think about what is that, one, were my assumptions correct, but then two, what conclusions can I draw, and then what can I learn from it, right? Because I can apply those learnings in future situations. And oftentimes we go through doing our work and we're so engrossed in trying to accomplish stuff that you don't examine whether or not it actually, the things that you're basing it on are actually true, and whether it does produce the results. Let me pause. How do you feel about this?
Who creates the hypothesis?
So I would suggest it's a team event, but the scrum master should be accountable for it, because the scrum master role, they're accountable for the effectiveness of the team. So that productivity hypothesis should be a tool that the scrum master is using in order to make the team more effective. So they should
So
own.
is that something that does that happen in sprint planning?
So I would suggest that the scrum master should come to sprint planning with that productivity hypothesis already created. And in sprint planning, they should be introducing it to everybody and saying, hey, here's what I think will make us more productive. Do you all agree? And if so, here are the things that I think we should be prioritizing and including in the sprint in order to make us more productive, right? And then they should get the team's agreement in sprint planning.
So can you elaborate a bit on the connection between our two fill in the blanks, our user story and then our hypothesis? Our hypothesis is given if then,
Correct.
and our user story is what is that?
Actually, before I go over the format, I'm going to fill in the
Mhm.
blank at a meta level.
Okay.
The hypothesis, again, in Scrum, your focus is not on building the product or service. Your focus is on learning, right? There's certain things that we think we know that's going to make us more productive, and we need to validate those things and learn more things so that we can actually be more productive. So the focus is on learning. Given that the focus is on learning, everything should start with those hypotheses. So I start with my productivity hypotheses and the user stories. Once I do my gap analysis, I created my hypotheses. I figure out what do I need to do to test out this hypothesis. The user stories represent the work that we have to do to test out the hypothesis. So I just make them into discrete work units. So that way we all are familiar, we all can agree. Here's what we need to produce. Here's what we need to do in order to test out the hypothesis. And so if I, again, everything we talked about as far as analysis, we talked about the technique of decomposition. I can take my hypothesis, decompose it, um, and produce the user stories. And in this instance, we talked about our hypothesis was I thought that, given that the chunks in the peanut butter are actually a good thing and they take up a lot of mass and space, given that if I actually use the chunky, crunchy, Jiffy peanut butter, then I thought I'd be able to produce more sandwiches, right? So if I think about how I'm going to test this out, the way I have to test it out is one, I had to make sure that I acquire the Jiffy crunchy peanut butter because we didn't have any. So that's the user story. That's work we have to do to test out our hypothesis, right? Well, another thing I had to do was I had to train everyone because they had never used the Jiffy crunchy peanut butter before. So I had to train them on how to actually spread it with the Jiffy peanut butter, the crunchy instead of the traditional generic smooth peanut butter that we're used to, right? And what else do I have to do? Well, you know, I I got to time it because I'm actually thinking that I could spread it faster, but if we don't time it, we'll never know, right? So I got to do some things to get the metric numbers out. So, I got to make arrangements so we can actually time it. That's another user story. So again, the user stories are going to be the things that need to be done in order to validate our experiment, in order to test out the hypothesis, all the list of things necessary to test out the hypothesis. Those should be the things that you include in your user stories, right? Now, in the format for the user stories is as a role, I want to, and then you specify the functionality that you want to do so that I can, and then the reason why, the rationale. So that's like the format of a user story. But again, and what I'm going to do, just as a FYI, the cool thing we talked about Atlassian as a tool. I'm going to share
Mhm.
my screen real quick, and you can see that because Atlassian is so embedded and in depth with embracing Agile on their site, they actually have the user story format. You
Ah,
can see it on their site, right? So here's the format for it. What do you think?
so okay, so we got our user stories being developed to test our hypothesis.
Hmm.
Can you connect this to the product owner's role in the product backlog?
Yeah. So when we decide to do some of this work to test out our productivity hypothesis, the product owner needs to make a decision. The team has a certain amount of capacity, and ultimately, the product owner needs to prioritize the most significant items that need to be performed for the team. So the product owner owns the product backlog, and that's the list of the items that we need to do for this product or service. And what we want the product owner to do, they got to reach a balance, and it's a judgment call. Eh, There's this book that I read a long time ago called Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. And the seventh habit was called sharpen the saw. And what they mean by that is that you got to strike a balance between production, like kicking stuff out, and then production capability, expanding your capacity to do more stuff. The more I expand your capacity to do more stuff, the more stuff you'll be able to do in the future. And what tends to happen sometimes is that people are so big on focusing on production, right? And I want it's called sharpen the saw because I can actually use a saw to saw down trees and get lumber. right? And I can go at a certain pace, but if I don't spend some time expanding my capacity or at least maintaining my capacity, if I don't spend the time to sharpen the saw, do some maintenance, then that saw is going to get dull and my ability to produce more lumber in the future decreases. So I've got to balance the capacity. The product owner needs to hear about the outcome from the retrospective. They need to actually take the stories that come out of it, the things that we want to do to expand our capacity, and the product owner needs to prioritize those in the backlog, right? We need to have a discussion on, well, how much of this are we going to do in the next sprint? Because again, it's a trade-off. Anything you're doing to expand your capacity to make things better for the future, to expand our productivity, decreases from the other items that you may have wanted to complete in the backlog. Remember, the product owner is trying to run experiments with discovering what customers value so we can make more money. And anytime that we include the production capability items, productivity items, you're not building the things necessary to test their experiments and get feedback from the customers because this is all internal feedback. And so, again, the product owner has to balance that, right? They got to do some productivity, capability expanding items for the team internally, while at the same time really managing things from figuring out what the customers want so we can make more money in the future. And this is all analysis on the product owner's part as far as figuring out what that balance should be. How you feeling about it? You see the connection?
Um,
Items from the
so,
retrospective make it to the backlog.
say that again.
Items from the retrospective migrate over into the backlog.
Okay, can you give me an example of an item from the retrospective? What is that? What does that look?
All right, so I worked with the team, and what the team figured out, and we discussed this yesterday. What the team figured out is that they were doing a poor job of when they were gonna miss a scrum event. They were doing a poor job of not just notifying each other. That's a given that you have to notify each other, but putting in their stand up. Actually saying, well, here's, even though I'm not there at this meeting because I had an emergency or whatever, actually filling in and saying, well, here's what I'm just going to work on so that everybody's on the same page in the line about how we're going to work together to reach the sprint goal. And so one of the Kaizen items was for the team to make sure they double down their efforts and making those notifications, and for the scrum master to check, right? So the scrum master has to do some effort. It's going to take a little bit of time to verify that they know anyone who is not going to be at stand up, here's what they're working on, to have that codified so that way the rest of the team members would actually know and they could plan accordingly. So that's an example of a Kaizen item, right? How big is that item? They estimated the work for it, and using the Fibonacci scale, the effort for it was a one. They're like, "How this is not much effort on the part of the scrum master to make sure it happens." It's mostly during communication inside the scrum events that they're going to actually make sure it happens. So it's just a one, right? So it was no big deal for that item to actually slide into the next sprint. It's just one story point. Now, let me give you another example that was bigger. They I worked with another team and we found out that they weren't spending much time doing backlog refinement. and we investigated to figure out, well, why aren't you spending the time? And what we found is that the technique for refining their stories, for actually specifying it to say, here's the appropriate way that we should make sure that we've detailed this thing out so that the stories are independent, they are um, necessary, they are valuable to the end users, they're estimable, we can estimate how big they are, that they're small, and that they're testable. To make sure we had those characteristics, the team realized that they didn't have the skill and they needed training. So now they estimated, well, to get that training, like we want it in the next sprint so we can immediately make progress. How big, like what's it gonna take to get trained on this thing? And when they estimated the work to get trained on it, what they figured out is that it was equivalent to an 8 as far as the story size. So it's not just a 1 where it's almost inconsequential. It's the 8, meaning, well, now whatever else that the product owner wanted to do, there's a big chunk of work that if we do this training, that work that the product owner wanted to do wouldn't get done. Right? We may not be able to make 3 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches out of the 10 we wanted to make, right? In order to get this training done. And so in this situation, in this scenario, the product owner has to figure out, hey, how important is it for me to get the information, the 3 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches we're gonna make in this sprint? Is it, can I sacrifice those 3 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and do this training this sprint? And in some situations you can, and it's cool. But in some situations, it's like, look, I didn't already call the stakeholders and set up the appointment to get feedback on this date on Friday. And if we do this training and you don't have all the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches necessary, because I invited 10 people, right? If you do this training and you can't do 3 of the sandwiches anymore, then I can't get the feedback from the 10 people I invited to taste the sandwiches. And so maybe this week, this sprint isn't a good time to do that training. Maybe we got to postpone it because I already invited these people, right? And if we don't have the work done to actually get their feedback, not only will I get the feedback, which is important, but I'm going to disappoint them because they're already invited and already committed to going, and we wouldn't have anything to show for it. So you see the decision that the product owner has to make. They, they've got to balance. Here's what's going on. We're trying to, as we do our customer validation with, but I know you guys want to actually improve your productivity, and I want that too. But I got to figure out if now is the right time for it, right? Because we may have some other more important things going on. How's this feel for you?
Okay, so as a scrum master, I'm going to come to the meeting with a hypothesis that I created after looking at the top items in the backlog that the team it will most likely choose to put into their top priority as a sprint plan. I see the number one item on the backlog. Maybe I take the 2 or 3 of them and I create hypotheses for each, just in case I'm certain that the team is going to pick one of these top ones, and then I'll have my hypothesis ready.
Right.
So, so can you say a bit about the definition of done? And I think I'm thinking of AOD. I think it's more than just DOD. For some reason, I keep thinking it's DOD and then AOD, or it's another one. Is it another one, or is it just the DOD? Can you tell me a bit about, as a product owner, when you create the thing in the backlog, what does it have to have? It has to have the DOD for that thing, and And are you creating a fill in the blank as the product owner for each of your backlog items?
So when the product owner is accountable for making sure that the items in the backlog are unambiguous, so everybody can clearly understand them, and that they have all the necessary detail in order to build and test it. Now, so it's not just putting the item down. I also want to include what we call acceptance criteria. So
Okay.
acceptance criteria are the list of the characteristics and conditions that one would validate in order to know that this user story, the work, has been completed successfully. And it should be like a checklist. I should have a list of items. Here are characteristics. So that way when you finish your item, the product owner, before they present stuff to the customer, the product owner should be able to look at the acceptance criteria and go one by one, right? They should be able to say, all right, acceptance criteria number one, each of these peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and she has peanut butter. Does it have peanut butter? Yes or no? All right, it has it. Check. It has jelly, right? Yeah, check. Um, grape jelly, right? I'll use any jelly. I want it to be grape, right? All right, is that check? The peanut butter and jelly is they're spread in equal amounts. Yes or no? All right, check. Right? The sandwich is cut in half, right? Yes or no? Check. Maybe some of the people you actually have, they're from the Danny part of Akron, right? And so they want the crust removed. So that's one of the business criteria. It's a crust removed from these things, yes or no? So again, you got to specify the details of all the things that make this acceptable, and we call that acceptance criteria. And that's different from the definition of done. The definition of done are the items that apply to everything, right? And so, to give you an example, a definition of done, for each individual sandwich, I didn't write this down, but the expectation overall of her making dealing with food is that it was developed in a hygienic and clean environment, and that the food is, it's not spoiled, right? It's actually good food for you to eat. It's nutritious, um, untainted. You haven't coughed on it. You know, so there's some basic stuff that applies for all food in general. That when I develop my individual stories, I'm probably not going to write down all these characteristics, right? But they generally apply to everything. Anytime you're dealing with food, right? So that's my definition of done are those quality characteristics that apply to everything versus my acceptance criteria that apply only for this individual user story.
Ah, okay, okay, okay.
And I gotta make sure both are taken care of, right? When the team builds the sandwiches, they gotta make sure that they meet all the acceptance criteria, but also that everything passes that definition of done. It meets all those quality characteristics too. You, in your goal in the day to day, I'm trying to build the sandwiches as fast as possible. But in my eagerness to do that, I can't sacrifice the quality of making sure that the sandwich hasn't been dropped on the ground and it's all dirty, right? It's got to be clean and hygienic. If you dropped it, I'm sorry, you're just gonna make another sandwich. You can't, just because you're trying to get your numbers out, just pick it up off the ground and serve it to somebody, right? So we gotta balance both.
So, as the product owner, when I put an item into the backlog, it's going to have an acceptance criteria. It's going to have a definition of done. Is it going to have a user story fill in the blank thing? Is it going to have a fill in the blank thing?
So generally, any work that we want to do that goes into the backlog, I I like to have this user story format because it gives you context, right? And let me show you why context is so important. So I talked earlier about who are the people we're interviewing? Who's gonna to consume these sandwiches? If they from the people in the hood, then you know what? When I was in the hood, I didn't wasn't too particular about what was in my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? But if you're serving this to the the dainty folks in Akron, right? You know they want their crust removed. In the hood, it's like you don't throw away that crust. That's food. Like we don't throw away food. That's crazy. But I go to the dainty part of Akron, and it's like, oh no, we don't eat the crust. That part is unacceptable. So I need to know. The reason that we had this first part is as a persona. I need to know who we're doing this for, because that'll affect some decisions I make on what I'm going to present. Right? If I'm for one persona, the regular folk of Akron, crust stays on. For a different persona, the dainty folks of Akron, crust get removed. Right? But I wouldn't know to make that distinction unless I knew who the persona was. Right? So I want that part. Then the second part, I need to know what they want to do with this stuff. Right? And again, this could be different. If I'm dealing with the regular folk of Akron, the the sandwiches are to eat. That's all I care about. The dainty folks, well, the sandwiches that we're preparing, yeah, they're going to consume them. But what's really important is the show, because they may be doing this for an event and they want to impress other people. So they care more about the presentation of the sandwich, which is why we're removing the crust, we're cutting it and slicing it in a certain way, right? Because it's got to look a certain way. And we care about that possibly even more than we care about how it tastes and the consumption of it, right? The So that part, the rationale. I need to know why. Knowing why we want things a certain way helps me to make the right decisions on how to prepare this thing. If I know that we're doing this for a wedding, and just roll with me because I know it's you're like peanut butter and jelly sandwich at a wedding. That's the first thing I can think of, right? But if I'm preparing these, and I got to be at a wedding, then everything at a wedding is going to it has to look super kind of fancy. But if I'm preparing these, for my kids' lunch, they're gonna put it in the lunchbox with an apple. And the apple, and the apple in the thermos and lunchbox is probably gonna smash the sandwich anyway. And then and then we talking to their friends at school over lunch, so they do not care how this thing looks. Right? They just want something good to eat, something easy and quick to eat that tastes all right during their lunch period. Because most of their lunch period, they're getting some sustenance, but they're mostly going to be talking to their friends and just relaxing anyway. So how it looks is the least of their concerns. So again, you want to know the rationale, like why they want this thing, so that you can make decisions on how you're going to actually prepare it, because it has a huge effect to it. So again, each piece of work that goes into the backlog, each user story, I want to have this format actually stated. It gives me context around what we're doing. And that context is essential for me making the right decisions about how I actually make it. This help a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. So we have two backlog. We have the product backlog, and then we have the sprint backlog.
Mm-hmm.
And so as we're decomposing, I don't know if that's the right word to use right here or not, but the thing that was confusing me is because since we have two backlogs, we'll have probably two user stories, and they won't necessarily be the same. because
Well, it's
perhaps we'll have several little user stories that will add up to the one big user story from the product backlog.
so with respect to the retrospective, in the first example that I gave, the we estimated how much it would take to implement that story, and it was a 1. And if it's something really small like that, that automatically goes into the sprint backlog. We're going to do it in the next sprint. But then I gave you that second example where, hey, the improvement idea we have involves us doing training. And that was at 8. That's not a small item. So for those items, they have to go to the product backlog to get prioritized. So we can decide when we can actually do it. And so again, remember in sprint planning, the product owner presents the top priorities and items from the top, items we decide to do, get moved from the product backlog to the sprint backlog, right? So when we actually decide to do it, when we commit to doing it. So eventually everything gets to the sprint backlog. But again, if it's a large item, we can't necessarily always just go ahead and designate it to go into the sprint backlog because it may have some big effects on other things that we already had planned, other commitments that we already made to our customers. And so we put those big items into the product backlog, and then we can actually, as a team, decide when it makes the most sense to move it into a sprint. Does this help a little bit?
Yeah, what I'm seeing is we go from a product backlog user story, and then we're going to create some hypothesis, and then we're going to create a little user story to test the hypothesis. What's the connection between the first big user story and the hypothesis?
Now, remember, the hypothesis is our focus. We're making the hypothesis. We made that the primary thing we're trying to accomplish to test out. And user stories are the pieces of work, the items necessary that we need to do to test out the hypothesis. Right. So we decompose essentially the hypothesis into these smaller pieces of user stories.
The, the thing that confuses me a little bit is because we're using the same language to define two different things. Because what the product owner is coming up with on his own to put in the backlog, we're calling that a user story. But then when the sprint team is developing what they're going to do, we're calling that a user story as well. And so it's I think that's the thing that caused me a little bit of confusion because we're describing two different parts of the process. And the if we look at that chart of how a sprint goes, where the product owner is creating his AC, his DOD, putting together his product backlog, all those are going to have a user story. But then when we go to a different part of that diagram and we're in the loop, we're going to create another thing, but that is also called a user story as well. And so that's just where a little bit of confusion happens for me.
Yeah. So what I want to actually present to you, and I wrote this on the slide, user stories just represent work, right? And I should specify your user represents work necessary to reach a goal. And it doesn't matter where it came from, right? It's just work. All work, all work that we're going to do needs to be in the backlog. Because if we can't see it, we don't know the effect that it has on our capacity. So we need to be able to have it in the backlog so we can see it and count it against our capacity. And I hear what you're saying. You're like, hey, there's work that's already in the product backlog, user stories. And then you're like, hey, but there's work that is generated from the retrospective. That's also a user story. And I'm gonna say, yeah. And that's okay, right? It's okay because it's all work. I want it in one list. And the example I would use for this is there's again, there's food that I want to eat that goes on my grocery list, and there's food that my wife wants to eat that goes on the grocery list, and there's food that my daughter wants to eat that goes on the grocery list. It doesn't matter where it came from, right? It's all food, and it should all go on the grocery list. Because if it's not on the grocery list, I don't know when I go to the grocery store that I should buy it. it this is all work. Doesn't matter where that work comes from. If it's not on the list, I'm not gonna do it, right? And so it all needs to go on the same list, no matter where it comes from. Did this help a little bit?
Yes.
Again, so I got I got work, and the work to populate the product backlog is gonna come from different places. Again, today's topic was on the retrospective, so you'll have some work that comes from the retrospective, and it's usually those big items that are focused internally on productivity improvement. But then there's going to be work that the product owner has gleaned and figured out, oh, well, we need to do this to make the customers happy. There's going to be work that comes from customers directly. This, you know, customer may have had something, and maybe they had a sandwich from you before, and it turns out that the sandwich didn't meet their satisfaction, right? Maybe they wanted the crust removed, and we had a defect. There was a little piece of crust that we didn't remove, and they're like, "Hey, look, take this back. I said I want my crust removed," right? And so you can have work coming directly from the customer where they want that crust removed, and they're gonna give us that work that goes into the backlog. Like all work, no matter where it comes from, goes into that single prioritized backlog. And we want to prioritize it. We want all the work there. If we don't have it in that backlog and we don't have it prioritized, well, do you take care of the new stuff that the product owner wants to do first? Or do you take care of the stuff that comes from the team from Retro first? Or do you take care of the stuff that comes from the customer who already paid and are unsatisfied with the end result? Do you take care of them first? It's why it all has to go into a single list so that the team knows
Uh,
what to
okay.
work on first. So
Okay.
what we do wrong in our society, we like to make lots of lists. We'll have a list over here, a list over here, a list over here. And how do you
Yeah,
know
yeah, yeah.
what stuff you should do first? What's more important? It's the stuff that's number one on list number two. Is that more important than number two on list number one? And
So that's where my problem was coming from. I was envisioning different lists. A list for the product owners user stories and a list for the team's user stories instead of seeing one list that's prioritized for the team to take care of based on their capacity.
right. Yeah,
Okay.
and I have to have that single list, or else you and I won't be aligned on what the most important thing is to work on and what we're doing. Because again, I'm going to be partial. If we got different lists, I'm going to be partial to the stuff that's on the top of my list. And if you got a different list, you're going to think that the stuff at the top of your list is most important. And then we'll always have conflict. So again, we want one single unified list. Then we can get alignment. Then we'll be working together. This all makes sense?
Yes.
Cool. Well, here's what we'll do. We've been going at it for a while. So what we'll do is we'll say actually I'll open it up again like we always do for last minute questions, comments from you before we wrap up, and we'll do another event and another episode. So any last minute questions, comments from you?
I understand now that we have to make one list,
Mm-hmm.
and it needs to be prioritized, and hopefully the team is going to respect the prioritization of the product owner.
Yeah. Without that, you basically you can't get alignment. So you gotta have that kind of unity. Right?
Okay.
Hey, well, look, this is another great action-packed episode, and so we'll wrap up here, and we'll get together tomorrow and go through another event.